The winter of 1940-41 was a time for reflection, planning and decisions, and for this purpose Hitler spent much time at Obersalzberg, where he could work in peace. So how did he arrive at his decision to attack the Soviet Union before he defeated Britain? This is, it seems to me, the decisive question of the war. Hitler was convinced that Churchill was waiting for either the United States or the USSR to enter the war against Germany. In Hitler's judgment, the United States would not be in a position to intervene in Europe until 1943. The Soviet Union would be ready by the autumn of 1942. The Russo-German Pact was useless as a guarantee of peace. Stalin would wait for the German forces to weaken sufficiently as a result of their military efforts in the West, and then overwhelm Europe with little risk to himself. Hitler intended to prevent this, whatever the cost. Germany could not fight on numerous fronts at the same time, and so it became his design to knock out one enemy after the other, either by negotiation or warfare. Secretly, he always hoped for an understanding with Great Britain, although he had known since the autumn of 1937 of Britain's predominantly anti-German policies. He worried about growing old, that there was nobody with the capability to succeed him in his work. Of course, his enemies inside Germany called this self-aggrandizement, arrogance, megalomania, and so forth. Hitler knew all this, and indeed mentioned it frequently in the daily situation conferences. The year 1941 was to be exclusively that in which the account was settled finally with the Soviet Union. Hitler made his preparations so that he could attack in about mid-May. His plan was for his forces to operate from centres in the north and south, and, after the conquest of Leningrad and Rostov, to stream them out on both flanks in a great encircling movement east of Moscow, which would, as he believed, so weaken the Red Army that it would capitulate. This would allow him to land the killer punch with all the military might at his command against his last enemy, Britain. In his New Year speeches to the Wehrmacht and the German people, Hitler mentioned the military developments of 1940 and promised that the year 1941 will see the German army, Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine much stronger and better equipped. While of the air war, he said, Herr Churchill was the man who suddenly discovered unrestricted air raids as the great secret for victory. This criminal has been bombing German cities by night, a horror which, in a military sense, has no more than nuisance value, for 3.5 months. This presaged a more painful type of warfare, yet it had a mesmerizing effect on the people. The patience of the German masses was astonishing. Most said that the Führer knew best what was to be done. They were all harnessed up for war work and simply carried on zealously and conscientiously. On 8th and 9th of January, the military leadership assembled at the Berghof for one of the most decisive meetings of 1941. Hitler told them, Spain has dropped out, France is against us, Russia has recently made new demands, Finland, the Balkans and Mariupol. Romania is on our side. Hungary has no obstacles to joining us. In Yugoslavia, everything remains open. Bulgaria is very cautious because they don't want to risk the dynasty. Britain wanted to dominate the continent. Therefore, they would need to defeat us. He intended to be so strong that this objective could never be achieved. British hopes rested on the USA and USSR. But we cannot deliver the final blow to Britain by invasion, he admitted. In 1941, the situation in mainland Europe would have consolidated so that we could see our way clear to continue the war against Britain and, if necessary, the United States. Of the new British Foreign Secretary, Eden, Hitler said that here was the man who wanted to collaborate with the Soviets. Stalin was clever and cunning. He will just demand more and more. A German victory would be intolerable for Soviet ideology. It must be our decision to force Russia under as soon as possible. In 2 years, the British will have 40 divisions. This could tempt Russia into a pact. To grapple with the Russian question gives Japan a free hand against Britain in the East. Japan is ready for a serious collaboration. Russian equipment was obsolescent. The Red Army had no well thought out organisation. For the first time before such a large circle, Hitler mentioned the idea of fighting in North Africa. The possibility of internal political collapse in Italy could not be risked. The problem was that in North Africa, the Italians lacked modern equipment. Here, Germany would have to assist with a support force. Hitler stated that he would go to war with the USSR this summer. Originally, he had intended to start in the second half of May, but because of developments in the Balkans and North Africa, he had now had to postpone the attack date, possibly until June. Those present listened to all this dumbfounded. Not a word of opposition was raised to any of it. Their faces had a set expression. I doubt if any of them saw the need for war against Russia. Only after leaving were the first serious questions asked. At the beginning of 1941, therefore, I did not view the future with optimism. If matters followed the course outlined, outright victory no longer seemed to me to be possible. I concluded that Hitler wanted to take over the Soviet landmass as a Reich dependency, whose purpose was to supply us with the raw materials necessary to continue the war against Britain. This seemed even more important if we were going to have to take on the Americans too at some stage. It was not yet obvious that this would be the case, but the reports from our diplomats in Washington were not promising. Roosevelt's utterances had lately become considerably more critical and negative towards Germany, and anti-German feeling had begun to gain ground amongst the American people. I guessed that Churchill had won Roosevelt to his programme. Hitler repeated constantly that we had to settle the account with the USSR before the USA came into the war, but presumably this had now gone by the board. On 11th of January, Hitler signed Directive No. 22, assistance by German forces in the Mediterranean theatre. In paragraph 1 of this document, Hitler ordered the CNC army to set up a blockade zone which, by defending Tripolitania, would render our Italian allies valuable service. From Sicily, Fliegerkorps X would attack British naval forces and shipping. Hitler discussed this directive in detail with Mussolini in Salzburg on 19th and 20th of January. Mussolini was very anxious for German troops to arrive in North Africa soon. In January, Fliegerkorps X moved from northern Italy to Sicily in readiness to attack British seaborne targets. OKH had sent General Freiherr von Funk to Italy and North Africa to reconnoitre the operational possibilities for panzers. He returned on 1st of February and gave Hitler his report, which read unfavourably, but Hitler distrusted him, and, in any case, the transfer of a light division was imperative because the British were already at El Agheila. Rommel had been appointed German commander in North Africa and arrived at Tripoli in early February. He was accompanied by Schmundt, who had been acquainted with all the pros and cons of desert warfare. Schmundt returned after a few days and presented Hitler with a clear and sober account of Libya. He considered the outlook for operations in this theatre as favourable and advocated the swift transfer of a substantial German force. As to the military strength of the Italians, he was very tight-lipped. He seemed to think they were almost useless. The German 5th Light Division would be put in the front line in Libya as soon as they had disembarked in order to shore up the hopeless situation the Italians had made for themselves. Rommel was predestined for the task. He enjoyed Hitler's special confidence, earned by swift and effective leadership in the French campaign. Unselfishly, he saw only the job in hand and set about improvising with the few German troops he had until others arrived. The British had had to send men to reinforce Greece and Crete, and this eased his initial problems. Hitler was not so much interested in pulling Mussolini's chestnuts out of the fire as in keeping his promise to assist the Duce. He believed that a German force in North Africa would help raise the Italian fighting level. However, it forced him to advise OKH that the attack on Russia would have to be put back by a few weeks. This highly disadvantageous delay provoked little reaction from the army leadership, a fact which surprised me, for at least 5 months had been estimated as essential for the Russian campaign. Thus, at the end of January 1941, it was already clear that the campaign could not be concluded before winter set in. I spoke to Hitler about this in the Chancellery one evening and discovered that he had reached the same conclusion. He explained that the German Wehrmacht would inflict such catastrophic damage on the Soviet Union during the summer of 1941 that only a short campaign would be necessary to finish them off in 1942. I was by no means comfortable with this reply and told him so. After this conversation, I had the feeling that North Africa had not previously featured in his plans, but that he had had no choice because of his loyalty to Mussolini. On 27th of January, we travelled by train to Munich, where Hitler visited the architects Frau Trost and Professor Giesler, and had a long consultation in their studio over his plans to redevelop Munich. At midnight, we returned to Berlin, arriving next morning. Next day, Hitler was advised of the death of the Reich Justice Minister, Dr. Franz Gärtner. Although Hitler did not like jurists very much, he thought highly of Gärtner, and over the next few days spoke frequently of his achievements. In the afternoon of 3rd February, Hitler had a conference lasting several hours with Brauchitsch, Halder, Heusinger, Keitel and Jodl, the idea being to solicit basic thinking about Operation Barbarossa. Jeschonek joined in later. Halder estimated the Soviet forces at 121 rifle and 25 cavalry divisions and 31 motorized mechanical brigades, about 180 groups in all. Against them, the Germans would array 104 infantry and 20 panzer divisions, the cavalry division, and 13 motorized plus a few Romanian divisions. Halder estimated that the Russians had about 10,000 tanks against 3,500 German panzers, but he rated the quality of the Russian tanks as poor, although one should be prepared for unpleasant surprises. Their artillery was numerically strong, but mostly obsolete. The German attack was planned with 3 army groups and 4 panzer groups strung along the whole front. Supply was to be fully motorized on account of the shortage of railways. On the whole, Hitler was satisfied with the planning, but repeated his idea of how the operation should develop. After the initial battles to overcome the frontier troops, he wanted army groups north and south reinforced along the line Pleskau-Smolensk-Kiev, so that they could advance respectively to the Baltic as far as Leningrad and in the south to the area around Rostov. Army Group Centre would, if necessary, delay their attack on Moscow until the 1942 campaign. Hitler emphasised that the primary aim for the year 1941 was the conquest of the entire Baltic area, plus the city of Leningrad. The army must always keep this objective in mind and ensure that the Russians gave up the Baltic. He then spoke about various individual problems associated with the first attacks and the problem of supply. An important point for Hitler was the flak situation. It was expected that the Soviets had an air force of note, and Hitler drove home the importance of air raid precautions and flak. He accepted the Luftwaffe operational plan for the campaign in the east. In the first 3 days, German bombers would destroy the Russian fighter force and so enable the panzers to make swift inroads across country. In the course of this long conversation about how to conquer an uncommonly large area of the earth, I thought it almost impossible that the set objectives could ever be achieved. Before the French campaign, Brauchitsch and Halder had expressed their doubts repeatedly and made clear their opposition to the offensive in the west. Now they accepted Hitler's instructions to invade the Soviet Union without a word of protest. It occurred to me that they knew that the operation was ultimately doomed, but had decided to let Hitler dig his own grave. This idea alarmed me, but I was daunted by the very scale of the Russian landmass. To this had been added in the spring of 1941 the North African adventure to prop up an ally of dubious value. The whole thing seemed very risky. In the evening of 60 February, Hitler travelled to the Berghof, where, except for a few short breaks, he remained until mid-March. February was a very pleasant month on the Obersalzberg. The duties were few, and the preparations for Barbarossa and to assist Mussolini in Greece were going according to plan. The air war over Britain had slackened on account of adverse weather conditions. Amongst Hitler's guests were the Yugoslav President Zvetkovic and Foreign Minister Chinkar Markovic. Hitler was determined to persuade Yugoslavia to join the Axis, but despite frank talks, the question remained unresolved. In Munich, in the afternoon of 24 February, Hitler delivered his Party Foundation Day speech in the banqueting hall of the Hofbräuhaus. Speaking of Mussolini, he stated, "Our opponents still do not understand that once I accept a man as my friend, I stand by him and refuse to bargain my attitude." He then went on to speak about the achievements of the Wehrmacht and German people, and left no room for doubt, but that, just as in the past this struggle has been blessed by Providence, so shall it be blessed in the future. In the evening of 28th February, his train brought him to Vienna, where on 1st March he participated in the ceremony at Schloss Belvedere, accepting Bulgaria into the Axis. Amongst those present were Ribbentrop, the Bulgarian Minister-President Filov, Count Ciano, and Ambassador Oshima. Even while this was going on, German pioneers were at work erecting 3 great bridges over the Danube, by which German troops in Romania could cross into Bulgaria and march on Greece. This was Hitler's deliberate riposte to Russia. On his visit to Berlin in November 1940, Molotov had expressed the Soviet Union's strong interest in Bulgaria. At the time, Hitler had not given him an answer. Now he had it. That afternoon in Vienna, Hitler had a very comprehensive conversation with Ciano. He saw it as important to give the Italians a clear idea about the coming war with Greece. He spent the evening with Gauleiter Baldur von Schirach and his wife, both of whom Hitler esteemed highly. He had known Frau von Schirach as the small daughter of his official photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann. Early next morning, when our train made a 90-minute stop at Linz, Hitler wandered in the town before the morning traffic set in. Later, he discussed his plans for development work along the Danube and the new Nibelungen Bridge. At Obersalzberg, the daily situation conferences with Keitel and Jodl began to occupy more time. Hitler received a number of visitors important to him on account of the impending Balkans operation. On 4th of March, the Yugoslav regent Prince Pol called. Hitler was primarily interested in winning him over to the Axis. A polite official discussion ensued which seemed unsuccessful. Hitler said that possibly in a few weeks Yugoslavia would decide to join, although he did not seem all that confident. Jodl was working on the Japanese angle. He interpreted General Oshima's return to Berlin as ambassador, as implying the readiness of Japan for a military collaboration, if not a close alliance. He suggested that Hitler sign an instruction which considered the possibilities, and accordingly Directive No. 24, regarding cooperation with Japan, was issued on 5th March. The first sentence explained, "The aim of cooperation founded on the Triaxial Pact must be to encourage Japan to become actively involved against Britain in the Far East as soon as possible. A common aim of the policy will be the swift defeat of Britain so as to keep the United States out of the war." The directive concluded, no hint is to be given to the Japanese about the Barbarossa campaign. On the evening of 12th March, we returned by the train to Linz, where Hitler visited the Hermann Göring Werke the following morning. He spoke of an increase in the current steel stocks, which would be necessary to step up Panzer and anti-tank gun production. Hitler made his annual Heldener Denktag, Remembrance Day, speech at the Berlin Arsenal on 16th March, mentioning attacks by British bombers which pretended that in this war the homeland will have to suffer heavier casualties than previously, and it will be not just the men but above all the women. Thus did Hitler warn for the first time of the horror of the impending air war against German cities, as to the extent of which at that time we had had no premonition. During the intervening quiet period up to 25th March, Hitler received Rommel, and after awarding him the oak leaves to his Iron Cross, Hitler discussed with him his plans to regain Cyrenaica in North Africa. Rommel was a great optimist. He foresaw no difficulties and was looking forward to the arrival of the 15th Panzer Division with its entire corps, with which he was proposing to move eastwards at once. His manner and energy pleased Hitler, who later praised Rommel highly and saw the development of the situation in North Africa in a very positive light. For the first time, the newspapers spoke of an Africa cause. Subsequently, Rommel made a surprise attack at Aghdabia, which set the tempo for his offensive. On 4th April, he took Benghazi and shortly would besiege Tobruk. Hitler arrived in Vienna on the morning of 25 March. The Yugoslavs had announced their desire to join the Axis, although they would not sign until they had obtained from Germany a guarantee of their neutrality. The signing would be celebrated with the usual due ceremony and breakfast at Schloss Belvedere. Afterwards, Hitler spent a carefree evening with the Chiracs, happy in the knowledge that the last of the Balkan states had joined the tripartite pact, although he had no great confidence in the durability of the Yugoslav government. 2 days later, diplomat Hewell brought news that Prince Paul and his government in Belgrade had been ousted the previous night. There was unrest throughout Yugoslavia, and rioting had been reported in the capital. Young King Peter had assumed the monarchy by decree. Hitler remarked that this putsch had at least come at a convenient point. If it had happened during Barbarossa, it would have caused him much more anxiety. Now he still had time. So saying, he ordered OKH and OKW to draw up the usual agenda for discussion. At 1300 that day, a large number of Army and Luftwaffe senior commanders assembled in the conference room. I also saw Ribbentrop, Göring, Brauchitsch, Keitel, Jodl, Halder, Hoffmann von Waldau, Bodenschatz and Heusinger. Hitler described the known facts and added that Serbia and Slovenia had never been pro-German. He had taken the decision to attack Yugoslavia at once with the aim of dismantling the state. He would not wait for some sort of declaration of loyalty. The operation would be linked to Merita, the attack on Greece. German forces would head from Sofia towards Skopje, and stronger units would go for Nice and Belgrade. A thrust from the Graz and Klagenfurt areas would have the objective of destroying the Yugoslav army. The Luftwaffe reported that von Richthofen's Fliegerkorps 8 was at immediate readiness in Bulgaria, though units of Fliegerkorps X would not so until 2 to 3 days later. Hitler ordered all preparations set in train and requested that Army and Luftwaffe make known to him their intentions. That same day, Jodl committed Hitler's ideas to paper in Directive No. 25. Thus, the Balkans campaign entered a new stage. We reckoned with its beginning in just a few days. In the afternoon of 27th March, Hitler welcomed the Japanese Foreign Minister Matsuoka. During the wait, Hitler had been in a state of agitation. He was very keen for Japan to take measures against Britain. He did not know how far Japan was prepared to go, nor to what extent he ought to let them know of his intentions. He hinted to Matsuoka that the current relationship between the Reich and the USSR could change precipitately, and said that war against Britain had been unavoidable on the grounds of Britain's attitude. As yet, he did not foresee the involvement of the United States. Matsuoka remained impassive. I had the impression that it was a fact-finding mission for his part. His travels took him to Rome and back, and he broke off his return journey in Moscow to sign a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. This was a clearer statement than anything he had said during his visit to Germany. On his departure from Moscow, there was a very impressive scene on the station platform when Stalin made known how much value he placed on the assistance of our military attaché and ambassador, and the importance he attached to friendly Russo-German relations. On 30th March, Hitler summoned the Wehrmacht leaders to the Cabinet Office, where he delivered a 2-1-2-hour-long speech. Britain is placing all her hopes on the United States and the USSR, he began. The maximum armaments output of the United States would not be reached for 3 to 4 years. Russia is the last enemy factor in Europe. She must be destroyed during this year and the next. Then we will be in a position as regards material and men to control the air and seas. What has to be achieved in Russia is the destruction of the Red Army and Soviet state. It is a war of two world viewpoints. Bolshevism is comparable to a social criminal system and offers enormous danger for the future. We much dissociate ourselves from any idea of soldierly comradeship with the enemy. A communist can never be a comrade in arms. It is a war of extermination. If we fail to see it in that light, then even though we will defeat him, in several years the communist enemy will rise once more against us. In the war against the Soviet Union, what will be important is the extermination of the Bolshevist commissars and intellectuals. The battle is against the poison of degeneration. Our troops must defend themselves by the same means as those with which they are attacked. Political commissars and GPU people are criminals and must be treated as such. In the East, hardness now means mildness for the future. Hitler mentioned next the large numbers of Soviet tanks and aircraft, only a few of which met modern criteria. The great Russian continent and the endless expanses of terrain made concentrations at decisive points essential. It was important to amass our panzers and Luftwaffe at decisive spots. After the first battles for air superiority, the Luftwaffe must work closely in support of the land operation. The Russian would fail once he came up against the panzers and Luftwaffe en masse. After a late breakfast, Hitler resumed that afternoon, emphasizing the necessity for haste in the Balkans. Even so, the beginning of the Russian campaign had to be postponed by about a month. The Balkans offensive would start at the latest in about a week. It was at about this time that I noted down something of a special significance. Between 1 and 3, March Oberst Ing Dietrich Schwenker of the Reich Air Ministry had paid a visit to Russia to inspect Luftwaffe facilities there under the Russo-German agreement. I heard about this trip from various service centres of the ministry. Unfortunately, I did not get to speak to Schwenker personally, but the head of the Foreign Air Forces section at Luftwaffe General Staff let me have some important points from his report. From these, there could be no doubt that Russia was arming on a grand scale. Newly built aircraft factories of an enormous size were nearing completion. A huge number of airfields had been laid down. Everyone seemed to be very busy indeed. When I mentioned this to Hitler, he said that Göring had already told him. One should take this military build-up very seriously. He was firmly convinced that the justification for the war with Russia would be realized at the last moment. On 5th April, Hitler was advised that the Soviet Union had terminated her friendship and non-aggression treaty with Yugoslavia. Hitler accepted this report with a certain satisfaction, for it proved that the Russians wanted to go their own way. A few days later, the ambassadors of Yugoslavia, Norway, Belgium and Greece were expelled from the Soviet Union, since Stalin no longer considered these to be sovereign states. Our attacks on Greece and Yugoslavia began on Sunday 6th April. Hitler had ordered a very heavy air raid on Belgrade, which came as a complete surprise to the civilian population and caused many casualties. At the same time, the invasions were reported in the Reich by a proclamation in which Hitler described his efforts to spare the German people this altercation. He placed the blame for the situation in the Balkans squarely on the British, who had had a foot in Greece for some time. May people who are blind to the fact recognise that they have to thank for this the worst of friends, who for the last 300 years have been occupying parts of the continent, and in an order of the day to soldiers of the South East Front, he reproached the British for making others do their fighting for them. Just before Hitler transferred his HQ to the southeast of the Reich, he was surprised in Berlin by a very heavy British air raid. On the night of 10 April, the State Opera House, the University, the State Library, and the Palace of the Crown Prince were hit. Heavy damage was caused. The Opera House was completely gutted. Hitler was outraged, and as a result, he had a furious argument with Göring. I heard Hitler's reproaches about the useless Ju-88, with which the bomber squadrons had been saddled. They would rather have the He-111 back. Göring did not dispute the allegation about the Ju-88, but explained to Hitler that the competent director at Junkers, Koppenberg, had reported to him that the fault had been ironed out in the newest machines, and that the models coming off the line in 1942 would have more powerful motors. Göring usually had the knack of mollifying Hitler. The Führer gave Professor Speer the job of rebuilding the opera house. That night, Hitler left Berlin for his FHQ at Mönchkirchen, where we arrived 24 hours later. This small village lay at the end of a tunnel on the main railway line between Vienna and Graz. Makeshift platforms had been erected, and a military signal station set up. The train remained in sidings here for the next 14 days. The campaign was under the control of OKH and went off without any real problems. The only difficulty lay in the inadequate highways. In a letter, I informed my uncle, "This time we have our HQ in the train, which has been marshalled in the southeast corner of the Reich. From here, the Führer directs the operation. Since midday, it is quiet on the Yugoslav front. It is a good thing that we have got it over with so quickly, for there is nothing down here worth winning. Let's hope that it will tail off soon in Greece too. The British are clearing out from there, so it looks like the other side thinks it's not worth the candle. The battle in Yugoslavia was easier and we had fewer casualties than expected. The only difficulty was the terrain which held up the panzer divisions. The Greeks put up a fierce resistance on their side of the Bulgarian passes, Rupel Pass, and the individual bunkers fought bravely. At the moment, our troops are in action on both sides of Mount Olympus. According to the latest reports, however, the British and Greeks seem to be beaten. They are pulling back everywhere. It is good that the Balkans question is being resolved. It was always an uncertain factor. I fear that the arrival of the Italians in Dalmatia will not contribute to peace. The Croats are already saying that they want the Italians out of the Balkans altogether. If they have the weapons, they can do it. The Turk seems to be maintaining an honest neutrality. But the British are doing all they can to buy influence. They pay better than we do. We have now only one objective: to reorganise our divisions in readiness for fresh missions. The big question remains to be settled this year. Then we can fight the war against the Anglo-Saxon Democrats to its bitter end. The Greeks fought a brave and tough battle and held up our troops along the frontier. But ultimately, inexperienced Greeks and Yugoslavs were no match for battle-hardened Germans. Fliegerkorps 8th contributed to a substantial acceleration of operations. The Yugoslavs capitulated on 17th April, the Greeks on the 21st. Their capitulation to the 12th Army gave rise to an incident. Hitler had instructed CNCs to ignore the Italians in all questions of armistice negotiations and accept any offer without hesitation. The Italians were still in Albania, where they were making very heavy going of it. The CNC of the Greek Epirus army stated that he would only surrender to the German High Command and not to the Italians. After the armistice had been signed, there was a lot of ill feeling which culminated in the Italians declaring that they would only recognise the treaty if they were present at a re-signing. Feldmarshal List refused to go through it all again, and so Judel had to do it instead. After the surrender of Belgrade, I flew there in a Führer Storch on 14th April. The city was still in disorder. The air raid 2 days earlier had caused serious damage. Bridges were down. I obtained a motorcar at the airfield for sightseeing. Most striking was the state of the so-called Government Hill, where the villas of Prince Paul and King Peter were to be found. Both houses were undamaged. The doors were open, but nothing had been touched. Personal effects lay around in the king's villa. It looked as if the occupants were likely to return at any moment. This impressed me very much, for it gave me a clear picture of how war and peace were bedfellows. The days of the South-East campaign passed calmly at FHQ Mönchkirchen. I concluded from conversations with Hitler that his thoughts were more on Barbarossa than in the Balkans. He posed many questions about equipment of the bomber squadrons, but weapons and munition stocks of the Flak Corps interested him more. He was expecting heavy air attacks against the invading groups, and said that we would not be able to rely on empty skies as in previous campaigns. The increase in British air raids against the Reich was causing him concern. Goering had apparently promised him that the weaknesses in the German Luftwaffe would be overcome in the winter, although he evidently did not believe these assurances entirely. I had to tell him in all honesty that I had seen no Luftwaffe figures which supported this assertion. The interruption to Ju-88 production seemed too fundamental to be overcome as quickly as claimed. Airmen were saying quite openly that the Ju-88 was an absolute disaster. This conversation pained me, but I could only report the facts as I knew them. I put Bodenschatz into the picture about what I had told Hitler and asked him to advise Göring. Bodenschatz was well aware of the Ju-88 problem and said that he would do the necessary. I found out later that he probably did tell Göring something, although I think he was not as forthright with the Reichsmarschall about the difficulties as he might have been. During the stay at Mönchkirchen, Hitler received several visitors. On 20th of April, the OKW chiefs called by to offer birthday congratulations. Ambassador von Papen came to FHQ to inquire about the course of German-Turkish relationships at a time of radical change in the Balkans. Hitler told him very clearly that it was not his intention to perturb the Turks. King Boris of Bulgaria and the Hungarian Regent Admiral Horthy came on 19th and 24th of April, respectively, both intimating an interest in annexing certain parts of Yugoslavia. In these talks, Hitler remained reserved but polite and said he would consider their wishes once the occupation of the territories had been completed. Another caller was Oberleutnant Franz von Vera, a Luftwaffe fighter, pilot shot down during the Battle of Britain. He had been transferred to a prisoner of war camp in Canada, from where he escaped to the United States and then to Mexico. Finally, he had returned to Germany. Undoubtedly an unique achievement. Hitler was delighted to meet him, asking for his experiences and any information he had picked up which might be useful for the war. Amongst other things, von Vera reported a new British anti-submarine search system, which seemed to be successful. Jodl presented Hitler with fresh directives, numbered 27 and 28. The first was dated 13th April and concerned the conclusion of operations in the Balkans, recording that the mass of the groups deployed are being withdrawn for a new purpose. The other, dated 25 April, referred to Operation Merkur, the invasion of Crete. Yishonek considered this operation essential with reference to the Greek theatre and to make secure Rommel's position in North Africa. The train arrived back in Berlin on the morning of 28th April. Once again, Hitler was returning from a victorious campaign, and in the Chancellery he was feted by a melee of curious callers, congratulating him and attempting to obtain more details from Hitler himself about the campaign. But Hitler allowed little time, except at table, to relate events. He had nothing but praise for the Greek army, which in his own words had gone down fighting. Accordingly, he had allowed the officers to retain their weapons. As to the fighting quality of the Italians, he remained silent, but spoke up for Mussolini on account of his loyal comradeship in the war against Britain. In the same breath, however, he criticised the Italian army leadership and the royal house, which were pro-British. All Hitler's free time was now claimed by the final preparations for Barbarossa. One evening, the opportunity arose to speak to him about the campaign. I told him that earlier in my military service I had arrived in Russia on 5th of May 1929. From that time on, as I recalled, I had experienced only dry and fine weather. Therefore, I could not imagine why the Wehrmacht should waste 2 good months on account of the handful of divisions that we were waiting to withdraw from Greece. Hitler listened in silence and announced after some reflection that Halder, with his old-fashioned ideas about modern warfare, had learned very little. He would speak to him again. As I later discovered, Halder referred to transportation difficulties and the need to rest the men, reasons which I found unconvincing. However, in practice, Hitler would not interfere in Halder's measures once he had failed to convince the latter of the correctness and logic of his own appreciation of the situation. Apparently, Halder had not been impressed, and so Hitler accepted Halder's programme to bring up the divisions from the Balkans first. On 29th April, Hitler addressed 9,000 Wehrmacht senior cadets awaiting commissions. He described the war successes all, date, lauded the bravery of the German soldier, and demanded of his listeners never to capitulate. One word I do not know, and will never know as Führer of the German people, and your supreme commander, is capitulation, submission to the will of another. Never. Never. And you have to think in the same way. On 30th of April, Hitler discussed with Jodl details of the commencement of Barbarossa, which Jodl later communicated to the Wehrmacht in his bulletin of 1st May. This set the date at 23rd of June and meant that the General Movement Order would take effect from 23rd May. Revising the respective ratio of strengths, Jodl reported a substantial increase in Soviet forces along the southern sector of the front. Although the Russians were lately drafting increased numbers of troops to the central area, the German army still had a strong superiority there. On the basis of OKH estimates, Jodl reckoned that there would be up to 4 weeks fierce fighting along the border. The Russian soldier could be expected to stand and fight to the last. Hitler cooperated in the draft of this communiqué, which amounted to its seal of approval. On the evening of Sunday 4th May, Hitler made the usual speech to the Reichstag at the conclusion of a successful campaign, emphasizing the strength and achievements of the Wehrmacht. The year 1941 will go down in history as the greatest year of our revival, he said. He was not thinking of the Balkans, but of Barbarossa. Throughout the Reich, the impending invasion of Russia was an open secret. The soldiers at battle readiness in Poland, the congregation of supply formations, the conglomeration of signals groups, all this left little room for doubt of Hitler's intentions. The build-up for the campaign was on such a scale that its purpose could scarcely be disguised. After the Reichstag session, Hitler travelled to Danzig and Gotenhafen, where the new battleship Bismarck and heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen were working up for Operation Rheinübung, an Atlantic raiding cruise. Hitler spoke to the fleet commander. Admiral Lutyens saw over the flagship and obtained an impression of the ship's company. On his return, he was full of praise for the battleship and her crew. He had complete confidence in the ship and said that the commander would set out on the voyage without anxieties. The only danger which might threaten them in certain circumstances was an attack by aircraft flown off a carrier, his own greatest fear. He told Jodl that, in his opinion, heavy ships were now superfluous in warfare. They were always at risk from aircraft bombs and torpedoes, and there was nothing to protect them against the danger. Thus, whilst he had pride in German naval might, which Bismarck represented, he kept himself fully informed as to the progress of the voyage and remained very thoughtful. We left Berlin for Obersalzberg, where we arrived late on 9th May. Hitler made the observation that he wanted a few days' peace and quiet so as to return to Berlin in June, fresh and rested for the fray. He wished Keitel and Jodl restful days in the lead-up to the attack on Russia. In the morning of 11th May, Pinch, one of the two adjutants of Rudolf Hess, reported to the Berghof with a letter. Hitler, who was in bed, rose quickly and went into the hall to read it. Then he asked Pinch if he knew what the letter contained, and he received an affirmative reply. Pinch and the other adjutant, Leitgen, were arrested at once and taken off to a concentration camp. They had disobeyed Hitler's orders to maintain a special watch on Hess. Göring, Ribbentrop and Bormann were summoned at once. Göring came accompanied by Udet. There was a long discussion in which Hitler repeatedly expressed the hope that Hess would be shot down. He was furious that Hess must have had the freedom to make the preparations for his flight in minute detail, despite the flying ban Hitler had imposed on him personally. He attributed the behaviour of Hess to certain delusions under which he was labouring, and on 12th of May explained the defection of Hess in an announcement, stating that a letter he left unfortunately shows in its confusion the evidence of a mental derangement which leads us to fear that party member Hess has fallen victim to a delusion. Following this broadcast, the British confirmed the safe landing of Hess in Scotland, with the assurance that he was in a good state of health. Hitler reacted by having inserted in the National Sozialistische Partei Korrespondenz a footnote to his original statement, in which he further explained that Hess was suffering from bodily ills and was motivated to flight on the basis of astrology and magnetism. The statement ended, respecting the continuation of the war enforced upon the German people by Britain, it changes nothing. And that was the last which the German public heard about the defection and its cause. On 13th May, Hitler gathered all Reichs- and Gauleiters to the Obersalzberg and provided them with a full explanation. Bormann had to read Hess's letter aloud. Hitler spoke briefly about the case and saw in Hess's behaviour an abnormal interpretation of the political events of the time. Hitler nominated Reichsleiter Bormann to be chief of the party chancellery under his personal command. I had known Rudolf Hess for 4 years through his various visits to Hitler, when I listened to various conversations he had had, and on many other occasions. Had Hess fallen prey to mental delusions? I think that a night flight in a twin-engined Me Wonder 10, alone and without a navigator, could only be undertaken by a person in a sound mental state. In my opinion, Hess was sane and in full control of his faculties. His wish to engage in a dialogue with the British about the future of the war between Britain and Germany seemed to me unexceptional. Hess knew Hitler and his ideas about the war, especially the intention to invade Russia. I considered the flight to be a manifestation of his fear respecting the outcome of the war and of his helplessness to do anything about it. I shared these fears and in subsequent months found out that I was by no means alone in that. On 20th of May, paratroops and an air-landed force under General Student began the invasion of Crete. This risky operation lasted until 2nd of June, when the whole island finally came under German control. We had suffered heavy losses and had to fight for every inch against entrenched British Empire defenders. In the initial few days, when the operation threatened to collapse, Jesionek flew to the Peloponnese and took command, ordering the transfer of the entire 22nd Infantry Division to begin at once. This operation cost the Luftwaffe a large number of Ju-52 transports, but our forces on Crete were substantially reinforced within a few days, and the enemy evacuated the island shortly afterwards. The success was of significance for the war in the eastern Mediterranean. I wrote to my uncle on 23rd May. Since the 20th, the battle for the last piece of Greek soil, Crete has been raging. Almost 2 whole divisions were flown in, which should be enough to take the island. The British fleet turned up, but was driven off by our bombers. Crete has shown again that a fleet is at risk if one does not control the air. It is not easy for Rommel at Tobruk. But there is no worry. The conquest of Crete will make it simpler for him. The Führer selected General Rommel for the role personally. The army had suggested another general. On 18th May, Bismarck and Prince Eugen sailed from Gotenhafen and, after having refueled near Bergen, headed north-about for the Atlantic. They were maintaining radio silence, and we had to wait for reports from enemy sources. On 24th May, Bismarck sank the most powerful British warship afloat, the battlecruiser Hood, in the Denmark Strait. Raeder telephoned the Führer to report the success personally. Hitler congratulated him, but after that, his mood changed and he became very edgy. Nothing further could be done to influence events, and unfortunately, Bismarck's voyage developed in the manner Hitler had feared. The home fleet shadowed the battleship, continually increasing the number of units in the area, which included the aircraft carriers Victorious and Ark Royal. A hit in the forepeak during the battle with Hood had caused some flooding. Bismarck was a little down by the head and had lost a few knots in speed. For this reason, Admiral Lütjens decided to abandon the mission and make for Saint-Nazaire. For a while, the ship managed to shake off her pursuers, but in the morning of 26th of May, the British re-established contact, and that evening Ark Royal's torpedo aircraft attacked and obtained a hit astern which jammed her rudder. Bismarck was now only able to proceed in a broad circle, and British heavy units closed in for the kill. Shortly before midnight, Bismarck signalled, "Ship unmanoeuvrable, we fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer." Hitler and I sat alone in the small living room at the Berghof and waited for fresh reports. At EU036, a signal was transmitted addressed to the Führer personally. "We fight to the last in belief in you, mein Führer, and with rock-solid confidence in Germany's victory." I took down Hitler's reply. "All Germany is with you. What can be done is being done. The fulfillment of your duty will fortify our people in the struggle for their existence. Adolf Hitler." I telephoned the text to SKL at once. Then it fell quiet between us for some time until Hitler broke the silence and asked for the strength of Bismarck's complement. I told him there were 2,300 men. As the night progressed, Hitler grew ever more irritable. He said that he would never allow a battleship or cruiser out into the Atlantic again. Between 2 and 3 that morning, he retired to bed. I joined my wife and, in a drained mental state, discussed with her at length our first major naval defeat of the war. Late next morning, SKL reported officially that Bismarck had been sunk. On 2nd June, Hitler had a long conversation at the Brenner with Mussolini concerning Hesse, the sinking of Bismarck, and general military matters. No mention was made of Russia. On the 4th, the report was received of the death of the former Kaiser, Wilhelm II. Hitler sent telegrams of condolence to the widow and crown prince, and assigned the Reich Commissioner for the Netherlands, Seyss Inquart, and Luftwaffe General Christiansen, Wehrmacht senior commander in Holland, to attend the funeral at dawn. On 12th June in Munich, talks were held with the Romanian head of state. Antonescu said he was very interested in regaining Bessarabia and promised to send Romanian troops to fight alongside the German armies in Russia. Hitler was very reserved when it came to promises like this, made by persons of Balkan origin, and made no comment. The commanders-in-chief of the army groups, armies and air fleets destined for the Eastern Front were summoned to the Chancellery on 14th June. To avoid the influx of general staff officers becoming too obvious, a strict agenda of arrival routes, times and car parking was enforced. After a few words of welcome, Hitler invited each commander to report on his intentions for his personal sphere of operations during the opening days of the campaign. This provided an overview of the strengths of the groups, the numbers of panzers, and so on. Hitler interrupted rarely and listened attentively. The reports gave an optimistic opinion about the quality and equipment of the Red Army. After lunch, Hitler spoke to the gathering for about an hour. He said that this was a war against communism. He reckoned that the Russian soldier would fight hard and offer tough resistance. "We must expect heavy air raids and take steps to protect ourselves through skillful air defences. The Luftwaffe will win quick successes and thus lighten the load for the army groups. We will have the worst of the Marv fighting behind us after about 6 weeks. But every soldier must know what it is we are fighting for. It is not the territory that we want, but rather that Bolshevism is destroyed." He spoke in bitter tones against Britain, which preferred an understanding with the Soviet Union to one with Germany. These were the politics of the 19th and not the 20th century. Hitler proved with these words that his alliance with Stalin had been a purely political device to regain Danzig and the Polish corridor without becoming embroiled in a European war. He continued, "If we lose this war with Russia, then all Europe will become communist. If the British cannot see that, they will lose their leading role in world affairs, and with it, their empire. To what extent they will trust themselves to the hands of the Americans remains to be seen, but the Americans are interested in this war only for what they can get out of it." In the afternoon, Hitler had further talks with the commanders of Army Group South, which would be driving into a vast and expanding area. He said that the mass of Russian troops was expected on the Central Front. Once these were defeated, Army Group South would be reinforced from Army Group Center. Brauchitsch and Halder made no comment. On 21st June, Hitler dictated a proclamation to the German people describing his policies since the outbreak of war. "The reawakening of our people from despair, misery, and an abusive disregard is the sign of a pure inner rebirth." This was no threat to Britain. Nevertheless, they resurrected their hate-filled policy of encircling Germany. Within that nation and externally, there has been a conspiracy between Jew and Democrat, communist and reactionary, with the single objective of preventing the reconstruction of the new state of the German people, to uproot the new Reich and return it to impotence and misery. Despite all friendly conversations, Moscow had been preparing systematically for war. The German build-up on the Eastern Front was now concluded. The task of this front is no longer the protection of individual nations, but the defence of Europe and the salvation of all. May God help us in this struggle. In 1941, I was asked repeatedly if the Russians knew of or suspected our intention to invade. At that time, I could only answer that I supposed their long-range reconnaissance aircraft must have seen the build-up of our land forces along the border. What they could not know was when and how we would operate these units. Not until long after the war did I discover from an official on the staff of Karl Goerdeler, Oberbürgermeister of Leipzig, that he had been present at private talks in the Hotel Kaiserhof with Molotov in 1940. Apparently, they had told Molotov of Hitler's plan to attack Russia in 1941, but Molotov had not wanted to believe this and would not take them seriously. After his visit to Berlin, however, Russia began large-scale preparations for war. When they invaded, in 1941, German troops came across vast new fortifications, new airfields and so forth. The Soviets had been expecting our invasion, but not in 1941. They had decided it would be later. In the last few days before the commencement of the Russian campaign, Hitler was increasingly nervous and troubled. He was garrulous, walked up and down continuously, and seemed to be waiting anxiously for news of something. Not until the early hours of 22nd June did I hear his first observation about the opening campaign when he said, "It will be the most difficult battle which our soldiers will have to undergo in this war." I tried to picture the general situation and deduce what confronted us over the next few months. The war with Britain would go on as before. Hitler planned to attack Britain in the summer of 1942. This seemed to me to be wishful thinking. I considered a direct invasion of Britain possible in the autumn of 1942 at the earliest, if by then we had managed to see off the Russians. But I doubted Hitler's optimistic judgment of the Russian situation. The prognosis looked very complicated to me. Even more threatening was the United States. I feared that their entry into the war could not be too far off. Then we would really have a struggle on our hands. If Hitler failed to obtain a clear victory against Russia before the Americans came in, we would be faced, in the most favourable way of looking at it, with a long, hard war of attrition, the outcome of which was highly doubtful. Accordingly, I judged the general situation at the outbreak of war between Germany and the USSR as not in our favour. The only chink of light seemed to be that our enemies, seeing our strength along the Russian border, had decided to wait for the time when they could match us in armaments. That might be years, and in that time, I believed, it might be possible for us to defeat one of our two main enemies, and so be free to take on the other. The Army High Command was expecting a conventional war, but most generals were not in favour of fighting it, for the reason that we would now have a war on two fronts, which in the long run, Germany could neither win nor see through to a satisfactory conclusion. Hitler's concept was quite different from that of the army. He saw a confrontation with a hard and ruthless enemy, indicative of this being his Commissar order, by which he required German troops to shoot out of hand all political commissars they happened to come across. This order had caused much disquiet, and I knew that not all commanders had passed it on. It was the first major opposition to a Führerbefehl I had heard of, and probably it was not the first. I had observed, for example, Halder's oppositional stance to many of Hitler's instructions, and noticed how he had now ceased to argue. I had the impression that Halder had decided to swallow his pride and keep silent, but perhaps he had his revenge by sabotaging Hitler's orders subsequently. Thus, as we embarked upon this truly massive offensive, we had not only a disjointed leadership, but some were pulling in different directions, and in this I saw a great danger for the success of the operation. For his part, Hitler stood in the highest favour with the German people and had the unconditional support of the party functionaries and membership. He had never lost a campaign, and he felt sure he was going to win this one. He even spoke of the United States reconsidering involving itself in the European war. The struggle would be very hard, of that he had no doubt. He expected the enemy to be ruthless and wanted to encourage German troops to be the same. The Commissar order was a means to this end. Lenin and Stalin had grabbed power and maintained their stranglehold on the Russian people by eliminating their political enemies. Hitler proposed that the political commissars, who were instrumental in this policy, should be eliminated summarily in their turn.